So I got to tell you what this briefcase is. This was my father's. He was a lawyer and a judge, and he taught me everything I know, but I'm only responsible for the errors I make, not him. So I have had his World War II diary for about 6 years, and I never opened it. I don't know why I didn't open it. I just didn't. But I'm getting kind of old, so I figured, I'm going to open this thing up. So if anybody follows me on Facebook, I'm posting excerpts of it. And obviously my father was lucky enough to survive the war, but he was only 19, but he's a good writer. He obviously went to law school and all that. So I'd like to think that he kind of speaks for.
Some people can't hear you.
Yes, sorry. I'd like to think that, and this is really sort of off topic, but actually it's not off topic. I'd like to think that his memoirs and diary entries kind of speaks for all the people there who didn't make it, and maybe some of the people who didn't have that ability to sort of write things out. And I'm reading it page by page because I feel like this is my last conversation with my father I'm ever going to have. So I'm posting it on Facebook. If anybody's interested in the war, and we do talk about what people sacrificed for our liberties, and we're going to talk about that tonight. He was a real strict constitutionalist, kind of an FDR Democrat who I think became maybe more libertarian as he got older, I'd like to think. And I'm going to talk about grand juries. I know I'm babbling a bit, but hopefully it'll all make sense. I'm going to talk about grand juries tonight. And when he was a judge, so I'll give you a little hint as to what the problem with grand juries are. The grand jury in Erie County would always meet inside the district attorney's office. Inside the district attorney's office. This is supposed to be an independent body that exists to check the power of the district attorney. It meets inside the district attorney's office. I mean, you can't even go to the bathroom without asking for the district attorney's, bathroom key. So my father, being kind of a by-the-book guy, he was assigned to the grand jury part. And most of the judges, I'm very cynical about judges because of who my father was, and I grew up with all these people, and they don't fool me, and I try to tell people the real story. He actually read the law. Grand juries, what's this about? I better read the criminal procedure law. I better read the Constitution. And he read it, and he said, the grand jury is part of the court. Grand jury is part of the court. So he's wondering, why are they meeting in the district attorney's office? Well, that's the way it's always been. It's the way it's always been. So he said, well, that's not the way it's going to be in my court. I'm going to do the right thing according to law. That's where I fought the Nazis in France and Germany, I guess, so I could do the right thing and not live under some sort of a, on-high dictatorship. Well, so he had a meet in his court, and then the establishment conspired, the DA and the appellate division, which runs the state court system in Western New York. They meet in Rochester. And they said, no, we order you not to follow the law, and have them meet in the district attorney's office so they could be the tool of the district attorney and not the tool of the people, which is what they're supposed to be. So I think of this because I'm involved in all this grand jury stuff, which we'll get into, but I really kind of owe it to my father for getting me interested in these issues. So, bad news, good news. The bad news is I have a 40-minute speech. The good news is I'm not going to give you a 40-minute speech. I'm just going to wing it. So, but hopefully it'll all make sense in the end. Interesting, so let me give you a little constitutional framework The framers weren't anarchists. I mean, nobody really even thought of what an anarchist society would be in 1776. But they did really fear the government. They really were afraid of the government. They studied history. They knew history extremely well. Jefferson spoke Greek and Latin. You think any of these idiots in Washington could match his level of knowledge? And they understood, ancient history, medieval history, and modern history, which to them was like the last 100 years. All these civil wars in England, some of them about religion, some of them not about religion. The guy who said, I know we had a quiz last time about my tie, and I think the gentleman, there you go. So, here's another quiz, and I do have some books here, by the way. Just so you know, I have a little organization called libertymovement.org. It's tiny, and it's funny because I say on the website, I always get annoyed, and I know you have to fundraise and so on, but I always get annoyed at organizations that all they do is they don't do anything, and they send me fundraising letters, so I get a kick out of it. I say, well, we do not accept donations. And it's true, and the reason for that is I want to be completely independent, so I fund everything. The car I rented to get down here by book sales, so if anybody wants to eat, fine. So here's my quiz for the night. Who said that there's a right of revolution? Who said it first? So that's sort of a rhetorical question. It's really hard. So a guy named Algernon Sidney, who I call him the pre-founding fathers. It was Sidney and Locke and I think Harrington, and they were about a generation, about 100 years before Jefferson and the founders. And the King of England rewarded him for writing that book by chopping his head off. So the founders knew how brutal history was and how it was dominated by dictators. So they were really afraid of the government. They felt that government was a necessary evil. But they did something different from all the other, they did many things different from all the other governments, but I want to focus on one of the things they did that was really different is they took part of the government power and they didn't give it to the government, they kept it with the people. And there's actually two we could have. I love quiz shows. I drive my family crazy. I'm not going to torture you with quizzes. There's two things. There's two government powers that are powers in most of the governments on earth. You go to China or England or wherever, Russia, Australia, and there's two things that we kept in the US with the people. We didn't want to give them to the government because we don't trust the government. And one of those is the right to bear arms.
Yeah.
That's actually, that's actually a governmental prerogative, but we have it here. And that's to deter government tyranny. So, and I wrote a book about it. The reason I wrote a book about it is I couldn't find a primer on the Second Amendment, so I figured I'd write one myself. And it's not about hunting and target shooting and all that stuff. It's about deterring government tyranny and the corollary, which is that we are sovereign in our country. We're the only country that has that concept. The people are sovereign. So if the people are sovereign and you don't have the means of protecting your sovereignty, that's just silly. We're sovereign, but line us up and put us in a concentration camp, like we've done, like people have done in 25 different countries. So the other thing, other than the right to bear arms, that the founders kept with the people are juries. Juries. That's normally, like in France, we studied the civil law system. France and Germany and the continental countries mainly, they generally don't have juries there. The government, you go to trial in France, the judge decides your fate. So we kept that jury system. And there's two parts of it. So let me talk real quick about the trial juries. I wrote an article, if anybody's really interested in this, The Rise and Fall of Jury Nullification. And that has to do with trial juries. And I think we know a lot about trial juries because we see them on TV all the time. You never see grand juries on TV. I've never seen a movie with a grand jury. Well, actually, maybe like Prince of the City. Anybody really into police corruption, judicial corruption movies? Prince of the City, fantastic movie, by the way, but maybe he was testifying in the grand jury. Oh, and Serpico, the other sort of movie about cops, I think he was in the grand jury and he wanted to answer more questions. Those are the only two, I'm a movie freak, the only two movies I've ever seen about grand juries. But we all know about trial juries. There's 12, it's unanimous, beyond a reasonable doubt, and we see that all the time. And that is a very strong protective of our liberty because the government can't put you in jail without a trial. But here's the problem with real quick on the trial juries, then we'll talk about the grand juries. So when the Sixth Amendment was ratified, which protects the right to trial by jury in a criminal case, the Seventh Amendment protects it in a civil case. The founding fathers understood, and this was even the lawyers who disagreed with each other, like Jefferson and Hamilton didn't agree on much, but they both agreed, and John Adams agreed, and John Jay, and I mentioned, I can't remember the other people, but they're in my article. They all agreed that, yeah, the jury judges the facts, and the judge instructs the jury on the law, but the jury can also decide the law. They all thought that. The jury can decide the law too, in the proper case when it's just, and it's up to the jury to decide what's just. So that was the Sixth Amendment. Well, that's been judicially repealed. So you have this thing called jury nullification, which is sort of a taboo, and the judge instructs you in almost every case, you must follow my instructions on the law. Well, that's not true. I mean, that's the state of the law, and the government's army is bigger than mine. I only have one little shotgun. So yeah, that's the law, but the Constitution means you have the right of jury nullification. And it's funny, I just got contacted tonight, coincidentally, on the way here by Young Americans for Liberty, and they somehow stumbled across this article on trial jury nullification, and they want to start educating the college students. I'm thinking, that's great, let's do it. And let's do the grand juries too, because I'm on my way to Jamestown on that. So that's your trial jury. And so just back to my point about guns and juries. Yes, they're both designed to keep some of the governmental power with the people, because we do not trust the government. We do not trust the government. So what have they done? The government, of course, has conspired for decades and centuries even to take those rights away. And we know that one of the parties wants to take every single one of your guns. And by the way, I have an easy way to prove that. They want all your guns. Well, how do you know? Because they're not saying they want all their guns. Because every time they pass a gun control law, and of course Hochul just passed this set of ridiculous illegal laws after the Bruin case, to add just a mind-boggling array of illegal laws, including the, church security can't even bring a gun, although Judge Sinatra just ruled that. So I lost my train of thought. I apologize, but so what I was going to say was that they're constantly trying to pass new laws, but what they never say is, and this is the Freudian slip or the dog that didn't bark, I love both cliches, this is our last gun control ever. Have you ever heard them say that? That's the Freudian slip. They never say that this is our last one ever. Just pass this one. The background check, the red flag law, the good character, moral character, even though Clarence Thomas said you can't do that. but this is our last one ever. So they want every single one of our guns. So, and on juries too. So they have tried, again, they took away the right of jury nullification. It's still a power of the jury. If you're ever on a trial jury, forget what I just said, but you do have the power to nullify, even though you don't have the, quote, right. And of course, I would never advise citizens to violate the law, would I? So, and on grand juries, and now we'll get into why we're here tonight, and I'll try to be brief because I could really talk about this for hours because it's so interesting. But grand juries have been completely eviscerated. From the point where they used to check the power of the king in England, and then they checked the power of the king during the colonial period before the Revolution, and they just didn't indict people that the king's administration wanted to indict when it was unjust or these were imaginary crimes or whatever. The grand jury is just a puppet, and see, I really do have a 40-minute speech. So Sol Wachtler, who was the chief judge of the state of New York, and I'm not going to find the quote, but he did say, you probably heard this quote, a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich if you want them to. That's Sol Wachtler. So the grand jury has become kind of a puppet of the prosecutor. And when we had kind of a limited government and a limited set of laws that were designed to stop real crime, violence and theft and things of that nature, I guess that was okay. But now we have a bunch of imaginary crimes, like possessing a handgun without the permission of a judge. And that's not a real crime. That's a crime because the legislature has said it's a crime. And the interesting in possessing a rifle that the people on the Upper West Side of Manhattan think is really scary, that's what I call an imaginary crime. And that's why we have juries. That's why we have trial juries. And that's why we have grand juries. But the one thing I really want to emphasize tonight, and I have a flyer, by the way, if I have a 40-minute talk on this thing, but it can sound a little complicated, but I boil it down to 5 things on a piece of paper. The one thing that you have to understand, I talked about jury nullification, and it's a taboo, and you're not supposed to do it. Yeah, we're supposed to let judges overrule the Sixth Amendment. A grand jury does not have to indict even if the person is guilty. Even if you're a perfectly law-abiding citizen and you have a car accident and your SAFE Act non-compliant gun, which would be legal in 45 states, and which is legal under the Second Amendment, and you're charged, maybe you're in a jurisdiction that's not sympathetic to the Second Amendment, and you get charged, and you go in front of the grand jury, and let's face it, it's a violation of the SAFE Act. The grand jury does not have to indict you. And it's not nullification, because if you look at the criminal procedure law, it says what a grand jury can do after you receive evidence. And one of the things you can do is you can vote to indict the person for a felony. And that's, there's 23 people on a grand jury, and it takes a majority, just a majority, and it's probable cause, not reasonable doubt. But one of the things you can do, you can indict the person, and another one of the things you can do is, and it says this in the statute, you may choose not to indict them. So I guess the main concept of what we're trying to do with grand juries in this era of assaults on the Second Amendment and assaults on all of our liberties during the lockdown is try to reinvigorate the grand jury to be something like what it was originally intended to be and what it actually was for a number of decades. The bulwark between us and the government protecting us from our liberty. But I'm not, you know, I may be a radical libertarian, and I'd be the first one to admit it, but when it comes to the law, I'm just a mainstream lawyer. Like, I don't go into court. I argue what I believe are bona fide legal theories. I may not always win or lose, but I'm not like, you know, like you had the tax protester movement, and there's these people with somewhat quirky ideas that, even if you think they're correct, they've never been accepted in a court of law. Like, wages are not income. I'm not, that argument has, I looked once, by the way, starting in 1970. Those tax protester arguments, and there's like 10 of them, they've never been accepted in a court of law. This is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, this isn't like, oh, Jim Ostrowski said, and he's crazy, don't listen to him. No, the criminal procedure law says this. The criminal procedure law of the state of New York. So everything we're saying here as in this process of educating and what we want to do, I know I'm being a little choppy here. We started in Niagara County with Dave Mongello and Dwayne Whitmer, and this is the second program tonight, and we're going to Erie County with Nancy Orticelli's group, and I know I know there's other counties in the area, and then we're probably going to go to Pike County. I was down in Pennsylvania at the Rod of Iron meeting. I don't know if anybody follows that, but Second Amendment group down there, and we're going to do it in Pike County. So there's about 3,000 counties in the country, and we want to do this in every county, and it's obviously not going to be us necessarily, but we can train people and get it. We're playing around with experimenting how to do this and how to present these ideas. The first meeting in Niagara said, basically, simplify it, and you've been talking too long. So I've tried to simplify it and talk less. But so every one of the things I'm going to talk about tonight is bona fide in the law. How many people even know that? Does anybody here know that you don't have to indict anybody if you're on a grand jury? Yes, sir.
I was on a couple in Livingston County. We refused to indict.
Excellent. Excellent. And there are those instances, but they're in this era, they're all too rare. So we just want to educate people as to their rights if they're on a grand jury, and hopefully people will do what they will with their own constitutional values, and we feel that. So here's the problem with the trial jury. Like, if you get indicted on that SAFE Act, and I represented the gentleman who was had the first conviction reversed on the SAFE Act. He went through years of hell, and it's just taken him recently to get his life back together again. The legal fees are outrageous. I mean, obviously all of his money plus a lot of donated money, and the appeal process where I picked up the case, because I didn't try the case, but I handled it on appeal. And then even going back to the court to get his gun rights restored, and we had to stare down Letitia James to make sure she wasn't going to try this person again. And I said to her lawyer, who I knew, I said, you got a problem because you didn't do the paperwork properly. The clock is running on your statute of limitations, and you're dead. And she called me back the next day and said, yeah, we're declining to, we'll agree to dismiss it. But the point I'm making is not, you know, what a great lawyer I am, but how long it takes and how expensive and time consuming. But if you're not, if some grand jury had realized that they have this power, and by the way, I asked Judge Murphy, God rest his soul, he just died a couple months ago. Good judge, really. But I asked him once, can you start the grand jury? They don't have to indict my client, and it was a SAFE Act charge. And he said, well, I think the DA will, you know, handle that. Well, I don't have any confidence in the DA, and I don't know what the DA said because I never saw the minutes. But if we can save a lot of these innocent gun owners who are just exercising the Second Amendment right against these incredible tyranny that we've seen in recent years, particularly, and getting worse and worse and worse, then they don't have to go through that trial, and their life isn't turned upside down. They might not even ever know that there was a grand jury. So that's what we're trying to do here. So the other thing about the title of our program is How to Use the Grand Jury as a Sword and a Shield. I've talked about the shield aspect, and that's to protect particularly the Second Amendment, which is our most important right, because without that, you know, we've seen in many, many countries what happens, and it's in my book. Coup d'etats, they talk about J6. I mean, that's nonsense, and I'm trying to help out, you know, some J6 people. That wasn't a coup d'etat. You want to know a coup d'etat, you go to countries like Eritrea, for example, and Burma, Myanmar. Well, I had my case in the Supreme Court before Brune, and Brune mentioned my case as having been wrongly decided, but didn't take my case. I put in a supplemental brief and I said, you remember when we said that the Second Amendment creates political stability and deters coup d'etats? Well, that's what happened in Burma last month, Your Honor. So another reason to take our case, but they didn't. The shooting of unarmed protesters. There's two incidents, if you Google them, called Bloody Sunday. One happened in Russia, one happened in Ireland. The shooting of unarmed protesters. I think in India, there was an instance where about 200 people were shot to death. We don't have that in this country. We don't have the coups. We don't have the revolutions. The Second Amendment, you know, works. So, but it's under threat. And if we had educated grand jurors, just educated as to the law, not some legal fantasy, not some crank legal theory, just the law, that's all I'm talking about. Court rules, statutes, and Supreme Court opinions. And I will read the Scalia opinion, it's very short. We could start using the grand jury as a shield against the assault on the Second Amendment. But there's another aspect of it, and using the grand jury as a sword. And I've done several webinars with Naomi Wolf on the lockdown and COVID. I just did one on the mandatory vaccine for children, which it hasn't happened yet, but they're obviously want to make that happen. And we'll find out, I guess, after the election if it's going to happen. So I talk about in my longer talk, there's a bunch of, one of the webinars we did lists all the different potential crimes of the lockdown. Now, we know that the prosecutors are kind of, you know, mostly tools of big pharma. Oops, I hope they're not listening on video. Any undercover FBI? No, just kidding. Too soon. Bunch of crimes of the lockdown. And I listed them. There's an outline online. Well, wouldn't it be great if some grand juries could start investigating? And I'm not saying just run wild and go after people. I mean, but maybe you could start investigating. There's so many things like the exaggeration of COVID deaths to try to scare everybody early on. Do you think there's any false paperwork on these vaccines laying around? I mean, every instance of a false statement on a document that has anything to do with getting government money, that could be considered a fraud. So the other aspect is that we can use the grand jury as a sword to investigate the crimes of the lockdown. Atlantic Magazine now, they want to call an amnesty. Did you hear about this just like 2 days ago? No. It's going to be like the tragedy that my father fought in. We're never going to forget these things, and we're never going to stop tracking these people down. And I'm not a vindictive person. I'm a defense lawyer myself. But I like to say truth is the most vicious prosecutor of them all. We at least need to get to the truth. And yes, some people probably need to be prosecuted. Yes.
Real quick, I'm not sure everybody knows what that amnesty was for. I do. Could you please explain?
Yeah,
people know how heinous that
I didn't read the article. I just know that Atlantic said something about we have to, a lot of errors were made during the pandemic, and let's move on. But
Amnesty for all the politicians that went along with it.
yeah, I don't think so, because we all suffered from it, and my two kids suffered from it, who were, you know, and all the younger children and older children and elderly people in nursing homes. And no, we have to at least investigate and get to the bottom of it. So how much time do I have? Just want to. So I'm going to try to.
They can go.
Yeah, let me see if I can, and I'm not going to give you the whole spiel. You can probably watch it on YouTube, various places. So I want to get to, there's just Sol Wachtler's statement there. I want to get to Judge Scalia's quote, because I want people to realize that this is mainstream law. This is not anything radical. So one of the things I talk about in the longer talk, the judge is not your boss. And one of the problems is you get this grand jury summons, and you go to the courthouse, and they treat you like a criminal. And my father, by the way, was one of the few judges who objected to courthouse searches. He said, this is a violation of the Fourth Amendment. And he was overruled, and I agreed with him. It was about 4 lawyers, Alan Bozer, me, Mike Kuzma, and my father. We opposed it. And I won't go into that whole debate, but the bottom line is you go to the courthouse, and our women are told to empty your purses. And our men are told, take off your belt. I tell you something, when a grown man tells me to take off my belt, I can't even tell you what I want to do to that man. So the judge is not you. So you go in with this atmosphere of like, you're just an inferior player. You've got to deprogram yourself. Yes, there's humiliations and so on, but when you get into that jury room, the judge is not your boss. The prosecutor is not your boss. You don't have to indict anybody you don't want to indict. And this is actually in the New York Constitution. You have the right to investigate public corruption and misconduct, issue indictments, whether the prosecutor or judge wants you to do so or not. You do have the right to investigate, and you don't always have to just do what the prosecutor wants you to investigate. You can investigate on your own. That's my opinion, and I think there's support for that in the law. And let me see, so just a quote from Judge Scalia, United States versus Williams, rooted in long centuries of Anglo-American history, the grand jury is mentioned in the Bill of Rights, but not in the body of the Constitution. It has not been textually assigned, therefore, to any of the branches described in the first 3 articles. It is a constitutional feature in its own right. It belongs to no branch of the institutional government, serving as a kind of buffer or referee between the government and the people. The grand jury's functional independence from the judicial branch is evident in both the scope of its power to investigate criminal wrongdoing and the manner in which the power is exercised. Grand jury requires no authorization from its authorizing court to initiate an investigation, and its day-to-day functioning operates without the interference of the presiding judge, swears in its witnesses, and deliberates in total secrecy. So when you're voting to indict and deliberating, the prosecutor's not there, the jury's not there, and your fellow grand jurors are not supposed to reveal anything. So you are free to do as you please. And you know, I'll just give you the provisos. If you pull out a gun or pull out a $100 bill and start paying people, yes, that's wrong. But barring that ridiculous scenario, you're free to do as you please, and they do not want you to know that, but we want everybody in the country to know it. That's right. In all 3,000 counties. That's the Scalia quote. And I mentioned that already. Federal and state grand juries, quite similar. There's a few minor differences. The main difference is that, you know, everything in federal courts take it a little bit more seriously, and they are, after all, federal officers. And, you know, wow. All I could think of is Lexington and Concord when I feel like government officials are getting too arrogant. Oops, what did I do? I gotta get banned. So, patriots serving on grand juries do not have to indict for imaginary crimes that make it illegal for otherwise peaceful and law-abiding citizens to exercise their right to bear arms. And some of these crimes of the lockdown, threatening medical professionals with disciplinary action for making reasonable treatment decisions, I think that's a crime. Stay-at-home orders, mask mandates, vax mandates. By the way, the mask lawsuit, after we served Hochul, she rescinded the mask mandate like 7 days later. And there's been a bunch of briefing, and I sent it out to my people the other day finally. 5 different motions to dismiss. I had to answer all of them, and that's still pending in court. So that case is actually still going on. False statements about PCR tests, false statements about the lockdown. So many potential crimes. So reinvigorated grand juries can and should investigate these potential crimes. It's obvious that if it was up to the police or prosecutors to do their job, it would never happen. Because it hasn't happened yet, has it? So right at the end, I talk about, okay, what are our options? And I know everybody's excited about the election, but one of the things about being 64, I've seen this movie before. I've seen this movie many times. I remember a guy got elected in 1980, and he was going to make government smaller permanently. I don't remember his name. Nice guy. I remember 1994. Boy, they were going to kick some ass in big government in Washington. Wasn't Joe Scarborough one of the class? I might be mixing it up. Oh yeah, they were going to really go to town. No, they didn't do a darn thing. And then the Tea Party movement, which was pretty good before it got co-opted after about a year by the GOP establishment, they took over the Congress in 2010. And I have a book on progressivism, which some of you may have seen from the last time. From 1913, when progressivism comes in, to the present, no offense, the GOP has not gotten rid of a single progressive program. So we all hope, okay, now things are going to be different now. Things are going to be different. And, maybe if the GOP listened a little bit to the libertarians, the Ron Paul people. I remember we were trying to get Ron Paul elected a long time ago, and boy, there was a lot of resistance. Ron Paul's kind of like your parents. Ron Paul gets smarter as you get older. Ron was right about a lot of things, and his son's in there. Maybe things will be different this time. But there's another quiz that I love. When's the last time an election resulted in a significant increase in liberty for American citizens? And you can debate about it. My answer is 1800. When Jefferson kicked Adams out of office, because if you drill down, he slashed government spending, paid down debt, got rid of some of the alien sedition laws, but that's pretty much the last time. So politics, I'm not telling anybody who to vote for, whether to vote, or about electoral politics. I'm saying don't put all your eggs in that basket. Failure is not an option, because we know if we fail, we're going to be living in a left, progressive, globalist, totalitarian concentration camp. And when I said in 2014, progressivism, the idea of destroying America, I'm sure people thought, oh, he's just trying to sell books. No, I was just trying to describe what the book said was going to happen. And so many of the things that I said were going to happen, like a race war in the United States, happened about a year later. I won't get into the explanation for that, but I wasn't exaggerating. And we saw during the lockdown all these things we never thought could happen, and there we are stuck in our houses. We got to wear this stupid, idiotic mask and all sorts of other, terrible things that we all lived through. So Failure's not an option. Politics, not always reliable. As far as, we try to vote for something and then afterwards we don't know what's going to happen. As we talked about, what about violence? What about violence? And this is for the FBI undercover agents. The problem with violence is it doesn't work. Well, it's wrong. It's morally wrong. Violence is morally wrong. I'm a Catholic. My father went to war. There's a Catholic just war theory, which I think many of the other faiths agree with. It has to be extremely limited, your last resort, and you can't kill non-combatants and all sorts of other things that theologians know a lot more than I did. But violence doesn't work. We've seen that any sort of thing that happens on one side of the equation is used by the bad side to justify grabbing more power. So everything I do in liberty, the symbol of my tiny little organization is the dove with the olive branch. Everything we do is peaceful and legal. I recommend nothing that's not peaceful or legal. And the other problem with violence is that sometimes you end up with people running the show who are worse than, meet the new boss, worse than the old boss. And we've seen this throughout history where the strong man takes over and all of a sudden, what happened to that thing we were going to have where everything was going to be better? But peaceful legal methods like I'm talking about with the grand juries, and I'll shut up. The reason they work is because I'm out here trying to convince you of the merits of what I'm talking about, the logic of it and the rightness of it and how it makes sense, and it's going to work and it should work. It has worked in the past. And that way, by using persuasion, you actually change people's minds, whereas pointing a gun at anybody doesn't change anybody's mind, other than in that particular, as soon as you take the gun away, they're right back to whatever they were, good or bad. So, a gun is not an argument. Can't remember who said that. Might have been good old Ayn Rand.
Yes.
No offense. A gun is not an argument. So I'm going to shut up now, and if anybody has any questions, feel free. I have flyers, by the way, which, again, summarizes everything I just said, but in half a page, because the back page is about my organization. The front page is about this project, and there's 5 propositions. If everybody knew them, we'd have a better country. And why can't, in this age of the internet, why can't everybody know this stuff in the next 2 years? Yes?
I was curious about when you're saying about a grand jury taking charge of the situation and investigating and all that. Now, we've presented concerns about our voter rolls to our sheriff as far as duplicate IDs, which are basically voter fraud in form. Is that something that we could go through a grand jury process? How would you get it started?
So I'm more familiar with the state than the federal, but in the state system, it says you can issue a subpoena and the district attorney must sign it.
That would be the sheriff would issue the subpoena then?
The district attorney would issue the subpoena. They do it all the time. And who did you want to talk to? The commissioner. Come on in and talk to us and bring all your records. And then,
but that's if you are part of a grant.
Right.
Oh, yes.
You have to be part.
Right.
Yes.
You have to be
So,
part of a grand
yeah,
jury.
so grand juries are allegedly randomly selected. I've never been on one. I know you have. I don't know that many people have actually been on one, and we wonder. We're not saying anything, but they're randomly selected. So you can't tamper with the grand jury, or else we'd all be in a lot of trouble. But we can educate citizens, because eventually, if all the citizens know what their rights are, they won't be bamboozled or intimidated when they get on the grand jury. And then you will know your rights in advance. You can always check with the prosecutor, check with the court, or check with the law, check with the criminal procedure law. And then you can do all these things, but you have the right to investigate. Scalia says in his opinion, you don't even have to have really a grounds for investigating. You don't have to have probable cause. You might investigate, he says this in his decisions, U.S. versus Williams. You may investigate in order to prove that everything's fine, which is fine. You could say, yeah, we've heard these people complain. We want to make sure it's fine. We think it's fine, but we want to make sure. So you have a tremendous amount of leeway. Yes, sir.
A lot of what you said went over my head. I'm drowning.
It's new.
My daughter-in-law is currently on a grand jury.
Then I can't talk to you any further.
Is there any information that
I do, without you and I getting into a lot of trouble. I hope for the best, but this is only directed at general citizenry, or else bad things are going to happen. Yes.
How would you go about initiating a grand jury to investigate something?
You got to be on the grand jury.
How
So
is that grand jury initiated?
the grand jury is
Summons, right?
they're summoned.
Can you just give a little idea
yes.
of what a grand jury is?
Yes.
Because I think that
The grand jury's job is to determine whether you should be indicted for a felony, but also they can investigate public corruption, at least in New York State, whether it's civil or criminal. So
they have a docket, right, that has so many cases that they
the way it works is that the prosecutor, again, under our current system, the prosecutor or the DA, the U.S. attorney or the DA, comes in and says, we want to indict these 10 people. Here's our evidence, and I'll leave the room while you vote to indict them. So that's the current system now. It's not really, in my view, what the founders wanted, and it's not serving us well anymore. For the routine,
case, though?
sorry.
More than one case?
Yes, they serve a month. They can be extended under some complicated rules, and they hear testimony. It's largely directed by the prosecutor. What I'm saying is, in my opinion, and Judge Scalia's opinion, they can initiate their own investigations.
And when they're on the jury and have questions.
Yes,
Correct.
yes.
Answer all the questions.
On any topic they would like? Or
Well,
does it have to be related?
it should be related to some violation of the criminal law, but again, in New York State, they're explicitly allowed to issue reports for reform. They've done this in the past, not that often recently. So their jurisdiction is a little broader in New York than it would be in federal. Yes.
The converse of that problem is, go back to when Comey said that he knows that Hillary Clinton did illegal stuff, but he says, I don't believe we can get an indictment in the court for her. So because the grand jury was never convened, or that was never taken to a grand jury, there's no means for the grand jury to go back and investigate, is there?
Well, you want to talk about going back in history, because I can talk about that, because it's over. A grand jury at that time, I think, could have investigated it. But you're not going to do that if you don't know. You're just somebody who was summoned to court, and you don't know what's going on. And
What does that look like? Does the foreman of the jury stand up and say, I think we want to look at this case, even though it was never brought to them by the prosecuting team?
I think they would vote on it. And if a majority voted, then that should go forward. I've only been in the grand jury 3 times with defendants who wanted to testify. I've had, actually 4 times. I've had mixed results. One grand juror, one individual was not indicted. One was indicted, and one was indicted but went to trial and won. And when I asked him, now you testified in front of the grand jury, didn't you? He said, yep. And you're here now, right? Subjecting you, we won that. And then the other one was a gun case. That person did get indicted. But just by way of example, again, like if you're indicted for a C felony, you're facing 5 years in jail, you're going to take the plea. And that's why it's important to catch these injustices in the grand jury before they get to the trial court level. When you're up against that calculus of state prison time, which nobody wants to face. So, yes, sir.
I'm still a little nebulous on
Yeah.
the formation of a grand jury. Is it a standing body?
It's randomly selected. I don't know how many grand juries there are at any given time because the whole thing is so secretive. But there'll be 23 on a grand jury. Maybe in Erie County there might be 2 or 3 going on at the same time because it's a bigger county. Generally, I think, say in a smaller county, there'd be 1 going on at any given time. And then in federal court, there's usually 1 going on.
So it's a standing body that cases are brought in front of?
Yeah, but they rotate in and out.
Yes.
They could be extended.
So it is a standing body then?
Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
members.
Are you asking if it's always the same people?
No.
Okay.
I know.
It's usually, there's usually a grand jury there because,
Okay.
yeah,
That is.
yeah.
Did they listen to several cases?
Yes.
They meet one day a week.
One day a
at least
week
in
for
this
like
county.
6 weeks or
Yeah.
something?
That I don't even know because I was never on
For a
one.
whole day, and sometimes it's the whole day, sometimes it's half a day.
Or it's
because
8
some
weeks.
of the defendants don't show up, so they cancel that case. So I'm just saying that because my son just served this spring, and so I learned the process from his serving this spring. So yeah, it's basically a standing body for 6 weeks. You get the summons, you have to show up, and if they select you, you have to go 1 day a week for 6 weeks and hear whatever cases they bring.
Yeah, it's a tool that needs to be dusted off and could be used to tremendously increase liberty in this country. And I'm not saying don't do the other stuff. I mean, I have 11 different other direct action projects, but this one's really important. And I think, this doesn't really require like $1 billion and a big army. It just requires a loudmouth attorney and getting the word out along the web and then training other people to do it. Students for Liberty, that'd be great if they got involved in some other college groups. I can't do it all myself, but yes.
Just a question on the grand jury. So you hear the case, you've listened to it, you're going to make a decision. Is it just one person that has to say, I don't believe in this?
No, it's majority.
So it's a majority?
It's unlike a trial jury. It's
Well,
majority, 12 out of 23, I believe.
Okay.
Yes.
Can a citizen or a group bring evidence to a DA and ask him to please convene a grand jury?
That's one of those, well, sure, you can ask the DA anything you want. One of the problems is, I know people who've tried to contact the grand jury, and they're inevitably told they can't. Sometimes the judge writes back, sometimes the prosecutor writes back. So given that there's these jury tampering laws, anybody who tries to contact the grand jury is actually, frivolously, but at some danger of being accused. You're trying to just be a good citizen. But so one of the problems that we need to solve, and this is a gray area, but I would love to see a future grand jury get in there. They've been all educated in our seminars and so on, and they're woke. It's a woke grand jury. They've woken up to the Constitution. And they say, Judge, we'd like to send out an invitation to the public to send us their complaints. Can we get a press release out? Now, if the grand jury invited comment and somebody says, here's my complaint, I mean, I don't know how anybody could charge them with jury tampering. That's bizarre. But that's one of those gray areas. And the other gray area, it's in I think the state or federal instructions, the grand jury can't do its own research. Well, on a criminal case, I can kind of see that, the logic of that. But when it comes to public corruption, which is a large part of the grand jury, state and federal, in my view, the grand jury should be able to do its own research. Because if you're not getting it from the prosecutors, who obviously federal prosecutors aren't going to prosecute big pharma, I mean, their administration is down with Big Pharma. It's a matter of public record. So if the grand jury's not going to initiate their own investigation and do their own research, how are they going to do their job as Judge Scalia defined it in U.S. v. Williams? So those are some of the sort of gray areas that need to be solved, and we're trying to figure out how to solve them. That's the best idea I have, but yes.
So, can a grand jury be used as a tool to investigate like Anthony Fauci? Because in the book, The Real Anthony Fauci, Mr. Kennedy points out many illegal things that Fauci has done in Big Pharma. And it's kind of, why isn't this guy in jail? Well, can this grand jury thing be used as a tool to start investigations?
Well, without mentioning Fauci, I think the grand jury could investigate the many potential crimes of the lockdown. And maybe even potential crimes involving conspiracy to violate the right to bear arms. I don't see why not. That's the reason I'm involved in this, because time is short. I could be doing lots of other things, but I think this is really important.
Yeah,
Yes.
to that point, you also have you can file a civil case, a civil suit against him, and that's actually already been done. Jay Bhattacharya, the guy from
Yes.
what I'm talking about the Great Barrington Declaration, his people have already filed suit against Fauci, Collins, Redmond, Birx, I forget who it was,
Yes.
and Joe Biden,
Yes.
okay, for defamation and a bunch of other things, because they obviously, from the emails, they actually used taxpayer resources to try to cancel the guys who are doing the actual science, right?
Yeah.
So, but anyway, so that's another way to get to those people is to file the civil suit, right? So that then, whether it goes to a grand jury or not, in that case, I don't know if it does, that's another way to go after those people. So Fauci's already being sued.
You may find things in a civil case that give rise to criminal prosecution,
Right.
too. Yes.
But also the grand jury, if they did create or start an investigation or brought charges, then they would also have to have a lawyer that would listen to
Well, here's the thing. So, I mean, grand juries can only do what grand juries do. The prosecutor does have to sign the indictment. So, in a way, it's a checks and balances thing. But now what happens if the grand jury starts to indict people and then the prosecutor refuses to sign the indictment? We haven't seen that movie yet.